Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name again is Matthew Jones. Some of you have been in some lectures and workshops with me over the past 2 weeks. But for those of you who haven't, I am a lecturer at the University of Florida, where I'm in the writing program. I got a PhD in English literature and studied Welsh literature at the University of Connecticut. And before that, I got a master's in Welsh studies, Welsh and Celtic studies at Cardiff University, whence my interest in Welsh literary and cultural history. And so today I'm going to be giving you a lecture titled Literature and Culture, Wales in the English Imagination, Then and Now. But we'll be sort of talking about other things as well. So the sort of large topic is going to be, as stated, how is sort of Wales, the country, the people, the language, how is it sort of invoked, understood, deployed in the English language, in what is the English imagination, which is to say the English language non-Welsh, specifically imagination. So people, so from the outside, if we're looking at Wales as a sort of national and cultural entity, the language of the outside speaking to the outside about the inside. Right, so that's sort of in broad strokes what we're going to be talking about today, and it's sort of like a primer, right? So that, we'll be making some points, but it's largely an introduction to some of the sort of like the main sort of flashpoints of this sort of lineage, right? So what are we going to try to do today in this lecture? Like I've just said, we're going to try to trace the lineage of English language attitudes towards Wales and the Welsh across time, and to a lesser degree across space as well. And at the same time, we're going to try to trace the lineage of major cultural concerns and preoccupations, which is to say, what sort of things were sort of, on people's minds at different points in time, not specifically in regard to Wales, but just in general. What were people concerned with or preoccupied by in, the 1800s, and how did those concerns sort of engage with how the Welsh language was understood at the same time. We're going to try to better understand contemporary values, contemporary across time, including today, by assessing what things are perceived as threats across time. So what is the threatening entity? And exactly what are they said to be threatening? What are they threats against or of? Right? So if for instance, we say that a certain group of people is a threat, then what exactly are they threatening? Right. So that's what we're going to sort of look at in terms of the Welsh language, and also sort of we're going to try to be. I'll ask you to sort of bear in mind, trying to sort of keep sort of stock of what has changed across time, and what hasn't. Right? What things have sort of shifted, and where can we see certain similarities? Right? And so this image on the right here, I've borrowed from something called the Blue Books, the Education Reports of 1847. And we've sort of returning to them, but this is just a page. In short, there were 3 commissioners from England who didn't speak Welsh, who were tasked with sort of going through Wales and measuring the levels of education, again in very broad strokes. And so you see here some tables of what form these measurements took, these tests that they gave people, and you can look at them on your own time. But my favorite was always presumably asking a Welsh child or something to sort of write something in Welsh that is asked of them. And so they were asked to write good repairs, right? And so somebody wrote repars da, right? Literally, good repairs. They give what should be the correct Welsh, and then an assessment of it. So this instance is no language at all. So like a little bit of a hint here, we have people on the outside, sort of giving themselves the ability to determine what constitutes another language, both the proper usage of it and when it sort of falls off and is no longer any language. right? So we'll return to that. Right, but what are we not trying to do? Because I want this to sort of be kept in mind. This is not an exercise in anti-English sentiment or anti-English language, and nor are we trying to raise hostilities towards anybody. It's more subtle than that. It's more nuanced, right? As you'll see, this isn't about being anti-English. In fact, oftentimes, be people English, Welsh, American, whatever, sometimes the attitudes are coming from a good place, even if we don't judge them to be good attitudes, right? So it would be sort of unproductive to be sort of like in black and white ways in opposition to a group of people. So that's not what we're trying to do. Nor are we trying to reduce complex relationships into simple categories. Again, people are complex, culture is complex, the times are complex, right? This is not a sort of exercise in this is good and this is bad. All right. So again, we're trying to just trace the lineage. If some of you have probably been, again, in my talks, and if we're talking, and, so if you were to ask me what my argument is for something like this, the argument is broadly that, by gaining access to the history of attitudes, we witness that in crucial ways, some things stay the same and some things change, right? And so with the rest of the talk, I hope to unravel and provide some evidence for these claims. Okay, so what is our itinerary? I feel like with those first couple of slides, I perhaps have produced more questions than we had originally when I started. So our focuses are going to be attitudes towards Wales, the terminology that is invoked in these attitudes, how these attitudes and terminology shift, and sometimes, again, how they do not. And what's our scope? This is roughly the order we'll go, and we'll go through from the early modern era to the Romantic era, Victorian, we'll talk about the British Empire, and then we'll go into today. All right, and again, there's far more to say about each of these than I have time to today, but I can certainly point you in some directions if that would be of interest to you. But we do have a lot of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and do it. So we have to start from somewhere, right? And with Wales in its relation to England, I mean, my suspicion is that, you learn these things in history classes. So at the risk of belaboring you with information you already know, Wales was bound formally in the Act of Union with England in the 1530s, even if it was conquered before that, right? So, in fact, many claim that Wales thus is the first colony of the English Empire. And so something to bear in mind at this time, there was no capital of Wales. That didn't come until the 50s, 1950s, that is. There was no university. There was no national university. There was no national library. All the way into the 19th century, none of these things. And again, the capital didn't come until later. And another thing to remember is that Wales was roughly 90% monoglot Welsh speaking into the mid-18th century. I mean, monoglot means that they didn't speak any other language, so spoke only Welsh, no English. 9/10 of the country. And so that's something to bear in mind when reading some of the clauses of these acts of union, including that the dominion, principality, and country of Wales justly and righteously is and ever hath been incorporated, annexed, united, and subject to and under the imperial crown of England, right? Forever and ever, forever and ever. So, that takes care of that, right? Ever has been, ever will be, etc. Okay, so what's the big deal? One of the caveats is that all justices, commissioners, sheriffs, coroners, escheators, stewards and their lieutenants, and all other officers and the ministers of the law shall proclaim and keep the sessions courts, hundreds, leet, sheriffs' courts, and all other courts in the English tongue. Okay, so what that means is from the very beginning, 9/10 of Wales did not have access to something like public office, as hard as that was for anybody to have access to. And thus to representation in the language that they spoke. Okay, so already the people sort of who can achieve positions of power and influence are not these people, right? Are not virtually all of this country. And so something to think about is, what does that mean to the people in England? Like what sort of reputation can you see sort of building over the course of a couple hundred years of this place over to the west where they don't speak English, but and regardless of that, they can't sort of climb to positions of power and influence in a sort of state legal sense. They're largely barred from representation, but they largely adhere to the state religion, largely Anglican at this time. Not entirely, but and the nonviolent people at this time. So you don't have to really worry about things like open rebellion at this time. But if any of these perceptions are wrong, if stereotypes of people are wrong, so because you can see how easily we can sort of shift from a group of people are legally not allowed to hold state office into they are not capable. They don't have the capacity. It's easy to sort of drift in that direction over time, not least since you can't communicate with each other. Okay, so that's sort of, at least in a legal sense, what we're looking at in the early modern period. Okay, and so let's jump ahead to the Romantic era, from 1750 to 1850 roughly. What were the general views of Wales and the Welsh at this time? See, these are just two examples of many. Most scholars agree that in the 1770s, perceptions changed from predominantly negative views of Wales as an inaccessible terrain and backwards nation to a growing appreciation of its distinctive landscape and ancient culture. By the 1790s, the Welsh were already drowning in a flood of travel literature, which ranged from the biliously racist to the embarrassingly effuse. So notice, again, what this means is that these are not openly aggressive, antagonistic, or hostile attitudes. These are, as both of these quotes suggest, by and large, sort of, pleasant, accepting, tolerant attitudes, right? So already, if we detect a sort of anti-Welsh sentiment, we have to filter it through the fact that these are not coming from people who are opposed to Welsh ways of life or to the Welsh people. Right, so that's something to bear in mind. I mean, we'll sort of like, this curious construction of something between biliously racist and embarrassingly effuse. You can probably determine some of that for yourself. So let's look at some examples of the literature from this time. So Joseph Hucks wrote a travelogue, letters of his letters from North Wales. He traveled with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. By what few accounts there are, he was a radical thinker, right? So this isn't, a sort of militaristic, conservative, genocidal perspective, right? This is a radical, progressive mind at the time who wrote, after traveling through Wales, that the Welsh do not trouble themselves with the politics of the times, or addict themselves to the habits of thinking, and the cares of the world they have little concern with, for they are free from those occupations, those tremulous solicitudes which engross the attention of a commercial people. I mean, he doesn't speak Welsh, right? So these are just observations, but from his perspective, the Welsh do not trouble themselves with the politics of the time, nor addict themselves to the habits of thinking, nor the cares of the world. Right? So you can start to sort of see what the image is. You can start to create an image of this population in the English imagination. Again, the radical English imagination. Happy Cambrians, says John Evans, around the same time. I believe that this is 1798. May the follies of refinement or the vices of luxury never interrupt your repose. This is a people in repose, because remember, they aren't thinking about the world, apparently. Refinement has not yet deadened the natural feelings of the Welsh, nor produced that apathy of behavior which prevails among a more polished people. Right? And of course, at the bottom of all of this, what keeps the Welsh, what allows for such constructions to have any traction, is that Wales speaks Welsh. right? Like these tourists cannot walk up to somebody and say, hey, do you trouble yourself with the, cares of the world or the habits of thinking? You can't have that conversation. So it's really easy to just say that they don't, right? I mean, they can't even hold public office, remember, right? So again, notice how, though, that this is sort of these are still people of Cambria, people of Britain, right? These are sort of, honored traits. And here's Percy Shelley. He might be a familiar name, another radical poet of the time. Do thou, wild Cambria, calm each struggling thought. Cast thy sweet veil of rocks and woods between, that by the soul to indignation wrought mountains and dells be mingled with the scene. Separate us from the commercial world, from the sort of mercantile, from the trappings of London. And stay preserved, stay sort of undisturbed by such things, by the sort of like these worldly pursuits that dampen, the sensitivities of a more polished people, right? So again, this is praise. These are, if only everybody were like this, right? These aren't like, so if you find yourself thinking like these are sort of anti-Welsh thoughts, are they? And we'll think about that, right? Because again, nobody here is saying that the Welsh need to change. In fact, they're saying the opposite. Although, so this is from a children's novel by Eleanor Sleath, writing in 1815, I believe. So this is describing a fictional character, a fictional Welsh woman. Although belonging to almost the lowest class of Welsh peasantry, and of course wholly uneducated, Dame Morgan is her name, is a striking example of the power of a virtuous integrity to procure a high degree of esteem from those who, having had superior advantages, are destined to move in the higher ranks of society. So that's what somebody from Wales can sort of look forward to in terms of prestige. Climbing the ladder to the point that somebody in a higher rank of society holds them in high esteem. That is the ceiling, right? Or is a ceiling. So like, put all of this together. Nobody is saying that these are bad things, right? Again, we haven't even gotten into whether they're true or not. But nobody here is anti-Welsh. It's complex. It's complicated, right? So these are this is sampling of the attitudes. But let's look at the other side of the coin really quickly so that we don't lose track of this, right? So we have the sort of popular English portrayal of, of Welsh culture and identity, Welsh thought, Welsh identity. But at the same time, so this is the sort of coming from the world that, many Welsh people don't have immediate access to by virtue of not speaking English. Things filter through, of course, right? But let's look at the Welsh world that these travelers don't have access to because they don't speak Welsh. Siwan Rosser at Cardiff University wrote in Welsh, this is my translation, we envy that culture that could maintain over 50 Welsh language periodicals and a dozen Welsh language weekly, monthly, and quarterly newspapers, right? So is this an uneducated population that can read this, that reads this much? There's a high literacy rate, due largely to a system, of grassroots education started in the 1730s called the circulating schools. There was the Eisteddfod was revived at this time. So this is cultural activity, to say nothing of literary activity. By the time we got into the mid-Victorian period, though, there was a shift in religiosity away from the Anglican Church and towards nonconformity. Non-Anglican Protestant, Methodist, Baptist, what have you, Independent. And there were at least 15 religious revivals from 1762 to 1859. That's a lot. Right, so compare this with the portrayals of a people who don't addict themselves to the habits of thinking. I mean, it's just simply incongruent, right? But at the same time, how does this sort of find itself conveyed to a world that is portraying it in different ways, right? Because again, at this time, much of the country still didn't speak English, right? There was an entire separate world literary world, cultural world, everything. And so you can see in the Romantic English imagination, the Welsh played this sort of crucial role as the ancient Britons, right? Let's gaze upon them from afar in these simple ways of life. Right? You saw some of that rhetoric, and it was a good thing, right? So, but behind the scenes, if you will, not really behind the scenes, but happening at this time, before the Blue Books of 1847, and again, we'll get there, Wales had become, because of unrest, the most heavily militarized zone in Britain. That's how active Wales was across the whole country. Not in sort of like a national separatist way, but in a sort of like, resisting one form or another of perceived oppression or slight way. The Rebecca riots, the Scotch cattle, corn riots, the Chartist rising of Newport, the Merthyr rising, those were in 1839 and 1831. And so you find that, there needs to be action at the state level to sort of quell this. So in 1846, the precursor to the Blue Books, a member of parliament, a radical member of parliament, everything you see, if you Wikipedia him or look at anything, he's a radical. That's the word that's used. Progressive. Radical in the sense of, again, sort of, for people's rights and for their ways of life. William Williams from South Wales, Llampumsaint, I think, Carmarthenshire, I think. In his speech to Parliament, that from which the Blue Books came, he said that in terms of Wales, so again, this is a Welsh person who spoke Welsh, from Welsh-speaking Wales. So this is somebody who wants the betterment of the Welsh people, whatever that means. The moral power of the schoolmaster was a more economical and effectual instrument for governing this people than the bayonet. All right, so there's that sort of colonial language again, right? Who do you use bayonets on, right? And who do you govern? You govern and you use bayonets on natives of colonies that you're sort of colonizing, right? But in the case of Wales, more effective than that is the moral power of the schoolmaster, okay? So sort of before we jump into the Blue Books, again, so we know roughly what they are. They were a government report on the state of education in Wales, and specifically Welsh-speaking Wales, of which, of course, is most of it at this time. If we go, all the way back, this green part here is monoglot Welsh-speaking Wales in the 18th century. This pink part is bilingual areas, Welsh and English, and the white is monoglot English. So you can see how much of Wales did not speak English at this time. My apologies. So what I want you to think about backwards and forwards are what qualities of the Welsh were highlighted and focused on. What did people say about them? What did Joseph Huck say about them? What did John Evans say? May the follies of luxury never interrupt your repose, you people who don't addict yourselves to the habits of thinking, and what have you, right? What were the views of Wales, its people, their culture, and their language overall? Again, these were, on the surface, quite positive appraisals of Welsh life. People would stop short of wanting to sacrifice their sort of refinement and become Welsh, it would appear, but, these were not negative. How did authors situate Wales within a larger scope of Britishness? Again, these were the original Britons, the original Cambrians. Even if the attitudes seemed discriminatory, were they hostile? Again, it's not easy. Not easy questions to answer. Were they, in fact, anti-Welsh? And as we turn to some passages from the 1847 Blue Books, try to keep an eye on how attitudes towards the same qualities has shifted, right? So there's same elements of Welsh identity that were praised in the, early 1800s. This is only 30, 40 years after that. Okay, so here's just some sampling of Welsh people in life in general. Okay, so we have authors stating that it is still the same people, whether in the country or among the furnaces, right? So this is in the sort of heat of the industrial era. The Welsh element is never found at the top of the social scale, nor in its own body does it exhibit much variety of gradation. All right, so notice that we're saying more or less the same things as the Romantic authors did, but the tone seems a little bit different. The Romantic authors also said that the Welsh never got to this top of the social scale. But something about this seems a little bit different. Let's keep going. Equally in his new as well as his old home in, urban, urban industrial South Wales as opposed to more agricultural, rural Northwest Wales, his language keeps him under the hatches, being one in which he can neither acquire nor communicate the necessary information. It is a language of old-fashioned agriculture, of theology, and of simple rustic life, while all the world about him is English. All right, so we have some differing attitudes toward the Welsh language and whether people should continue to speak it. The Welsh person is left to live in an underworld of his own, and the march of society goes on completely over his head that he has never heard of, accepting the strange and abnormal features of a revival or a Rebecca or a Chartist outbreak, call attention to a phase of society which could produce anything so contrary to all that we elsewhere experience. This is some heavy rhetoric. The march of society, look at this imagery, goes on over top of Wales, the Welsh person, who is static, in terms of progress. And the only time you hear of them at all are when these, when the voices are raised in terms of religion or in terms of social unrest, what have you. And all this does is remind us of a phase of society that, is so far removed from today that it baffles you, right? Again, this is the same imagery of before, but the attitudes are different. And the rhetoric is different too. The Welsh language is a vast drawback to Wales and a manifold barrier to the moral progress and commercial prosperity of the people. It is not easy to overestimate its evil effects. So now we have seen a tectonic shift in attitudes towards the Welsh language. Let's dive in and look at things with a little bit more specificity. Let's look at Welsh literary culture as it is sort of understood in the blue books, which again, are sort of like the opinion-forming texts or coming from the opinion-forming people of Welsh language, literary, and cultural society. Welsh dissevers the people from intercourse which would greatly advance their civilization and bars the access of improving which would greatly advance their minds. As a proof of this, there is no Welsh literature worthy of the name. And strong language. There is no Welsh literature worthy of the title literature. Some thousands of pounds have within the last 30 years been given as prizes at Eisteddfods, without doing much towards producing either writers or readers of general information, without giving that character of solidity and usefulness which might have been given to Welsh literature. Right, so this revived Eisteddfod, it's not doing anything. It's not moving this culture forward. It looks like something that's alive and that's participatory and that takes, that sort of like, brings with it, again, it's a product of cultural activity. But no, it's not. It's not moving anything forward. I do not believe that there's a single book in Welsh on geography, history for general reading, which presumably means, non-Welsh history, chemistry, natural history, or any of the useful arts and sciences which owes its origin to an Eisteddfod. So that is the indictment. That is what English readers and the English public are meant to understand by the usefulness, the productivity, what have you, of this cultural activity. Let's keep going. What about religion? What about hygiene? What about Welsh, sort of womanhood? Superstition prevails to a great extent. charms are resorted to of the most ludicrous description, and which are reconcilable with nothing but a state of barbarism. So no longer is there this population that is sort of like blithely and welcomingly antique. This new word's coming in, barbaric, not the same connotations, although the same sort of idea. I refer to the alleged want of chastity in the women. If this be so, it is sufficient to account for all other immoralities, for each generation will derive its moral tone in a great degree from the influences imparted by the mothers who reared them. Where these influences are corrupted at their very source, it is vain to expect virtue in the offspring. So now we're attacking Welsh morality. No longer is this a sort of celebrated people. And in fact, not only is the culture and identity of ill repute, but the very act of mothering. Welsh mothers. Again, it's heavy stuff. It is a fact significant of the Welsh character that 417 schools, 71.5 of the entire number, are destitute of sufficient outbuildings, 210 or 36%, having no provision of the kind. The germs of the barbarous and immoral habits which disfigure Welsh civilization are thus implanted in the minds of children, together with the first elements of education. So we're blending here a sort of unhygienic, impure, sort of material life with impure, what it perceives as impure and unhygienic morals. Again, a huge shift from 50 years earlier. The traits are the same, the circumstances are largely the same, the descriptions are the same, or like the descriptions of life. But the way they are interpreted has this pendulum has swung as far in the opposite direction as it could. Notice that we're not, we're saying the same things about Wales and Welsh life. It's antique, it's, whatever. Again, these are people, again, who don't speak Welsh, largely. But the assessment is different. Where before that was something that should be preserved, now it is something that should be changed, and yesterday. Right? So, to what ends? Why? What are the effects on the reading audiences, on English reading audiences' views of morality, Welsh morality, Welsh morals, the things that, again, were sort of celebrated and praised not long before? Literacy. Like, again, Wales is one of the more literate countries in Europe at this time. Is certainly could stand, shoulder to shoulder in terms of its literacy rate in Welsh, right? Religion and imperialism. So we'll talk a little bit about that now. We'll sort of shift in that direction. But what the question that we have, the questions that we're sort of left with are, why did these attitudes shift? Why did attitudes towards Welsh qualities shift? And why the shift from knowing little about Wales and Welsh to knowing all about them? And what I mean by that is, why was, in one instance, sort of the attitude that, Wales and the Welsh, just continue doing your thing, right? We don't know anything about Welsh culture, identity, language, whatever it is you talk about, but that's fine, into wanting to dominate and control it. And certainly get rid of the language, get rid of those very things by which a population could be considered different at all. What's stood to be? What does one stand to gain from that? And another question is, did Wales, did it become non-British? And it's a weird question. And I apologize for that, but it's interesting that at the time, again, happy Cambrians never let nothing interrupt your repose. That's part of the island of Britain. And now the Welsh language is evil. And again, we need to, it needs to be sort of weeded out. So did it sort of, have we changed the perception thus that it's no longer considered what should be British at all, right? And again, I don't know. I mean, it's up, you can decide this for yourselves. One way to determine that is to look at how other colonial people were described and understood in the English imagination, English language imagination. So let's look at British India. This is from Lord Macaulay's Minutes on Education in the 1830s. And what was said about Indian life, culture, identity. We must do our best to form a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and intellect. Okay? So we need to impose Englishness onto this other people, right? They can keep their, physical traits, but in all sort of internal qualities that needs to be English. And what are some things that we can sort of correct? One is the cultural output. And a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Are you seeing some sort of similarities between what is said about Indian literature and what is said about Welsh literature? There's no Welsh literature worthy of the name. A single shelf, it says European, right? But I imagine that, the European, that's the same thing that they would have judged Welsh literature by, was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Again, the same thing that was said about the Welsh, and, roughly the same time period. In India, English is spoken by the ruling class. It is spoken as the language spoken by the ruling class. It is spoken by the higher class of natives at the seats of government. I cannot doubt that the languages of Western Europe will do for the Hindu what they have done for the Tartar. Okay, so again, look at the similarities. What is the sort of language of dominance, the state language in the United Kingdom, in Britain? It's English, not Welsh. So the point that, I'm trying to make here is that you can sort of see certain similarities in how these literatures sort of wanted to shape English language opinion of this people to how they wanted to shape English language opinion of Welsh people. The histories are very different. There's, there's no comparison between what happened in India and what happened in Wales. But looking at the rhetoric, and again, how the rhetoric, what role it was supposed to have, again, in sort of shaping people's perceptions. All right. So there's India. Let's look at another one. Let's look at Ireland. The Irish emigration into Britain is an example of a less civilized population spreading themselves as a kind of substratum beneath a more civilized community. This is the report on the state of the Irish Poor, another government report. This is the 1830s, also the same year as Macaulay's Minutes. And does this sort of hark back to, or hark forward to in this case, the imagery of the march of society going on over somebody's head in Wales? The imagery is exactly the same. The want of education or religious instruction accompanied with injurious habits, such as want of system, neglect of the morals, and education of the offspring, neglect of training them to habits of industry, is consequently productive of distress and has its effects upon the children, and leads to the utter neglect of cleanliness in the persons and habitations of such families. Again, you can almost like just sort of pick up and copy and paste what's said here and what is said of Welsh education, Welsh home life, Welsh hygiene, Welsh morals. So again, the question becomes, what does it mean? Well, what do we do with this? What do we like? And does that again mean that at this time were what were firmly understood as Welsh characteristics that were sort of, a foundation, a fundamental part of, the British people, of Britain? Are they sort of being pushed out of being included in what is British? If they're being described the same way, in dismissive ways, in derogatory and pejorative ways, as Indian life and Irish life. Nobody would say that, you know, these people weren't saying that like Indian culture, you know, that we should emulate it, right? It's being pushed away. And so what does it mean that Welsh is being, the Welsh life is described in the same manner, right? So again, what has changed? What has stayed the same and what has changed, right? Some of the traits have stayed the same, but the way of understanding them has changed. And so that moves us forward a little bit, some reflections and comparisons before we move forward a little bit more into today. How did attitudes towards the same qualities shift, right? Again, without any adjectives, Welsh life is described in the same way, largely. Again, whether it's accurate or not, you know, it doesn't seem accurate to me to say that people don't addict themselves to habits of thinking or the cares of the world, yet have, you know, however many newspapers and what have you. So the accuracy we aren't even really concerning ourselves with, but the traits are the same, but the attitudes towards them have shifted. And what do we do with that, right? What has changed in the background to affect this? What's sort of going on in the world to sort of spur this? What's its influence? What's the point? What's the significance of the shared rhetorics between accounts of Welsh culture and cultures of other imperial subjects? What do we do with that, right? I mean, this is a 19th century context, right? I skipped one. How did the attitudes towards the Welsh language shift? So we have in the early modern, in the 1500s, saying, you know, there was no call to eradicate the language as such. It's just, you know, you can't hold office. Keep speaking Welsh. And then the Romantic era, sort of a celebration of Welshness as such. And then in the Victorian period, a sort of call to extinguish Welshness as such. What were seen as the prevailing threats to 19th century cultural life in terms of Wales? You know, the Welsh language was called, you can't overestimate its evil effects. And how have they changed or not changed between then and now? And what I mean by this is, you know, and so we'll circle back, but what kind of rhetoric worked at that time in terms of, you know, sort of creating an emotional effect in our readership? You know, at that time, it was a serious allegation to call someone superstitious. You can't really, I mean, you can call somebody superstitious today. It doesn't really sort of carry the same weight. Barbaric, what have you, unhygienic to us, you know, all like these words, you know, they were strong at the time and aren't as strong now in a lot of the same ways. But what matters today, right? But let's look really quickly at some details of Wales. So if you see this map here, this is the Welsh language today. I can't find a different map, so the colors throw us off a little bit. If you can imagine this, instead of a green gradient, a pink one to match this, because this is bilingual Wales. This is just where Welsh are spoken at all. You can see how much less than in 1750. So this is like the 21st century. This is the 18th century. Population 3.13 million roughly. Welsh fluency, it's climbing, but you know, it's far less than it used to be. And again, this is fluency, not monolinguals. How have social concerns shifted again over the past 500 years? Or have they? What are the prevailing views of the Welsh language today from the outside? And how do they incorporate current concerns? And again, so any of you are more in touch with this than I am. I mean, when I lived there, I might have been able to answer some of these questions. I mean, I imagine things have shifted a bit since then. So when you think of any attitudes from the outside towards Wales and the Welsh language, what comes to mind? You know, not strictly negative things, because as we've seen, you know, like just by, just somebody saying things that we perceive of as being misguided isn't always coming from a place that is having negative intent, right? Like think back to Joseph Hucks, Percy Shelley, and all them. Like none of them were saying that, like we're sort of anti-Welsh. They propagated perceptions and images of a Welshness that might not have been perfectly in sync with reality, but they weren't anti-Welsh, right? So it doesn't have to be just negativity, right? It can be anything. So what are the views? What do people say? And how do they incorporate current concerns? So here's a couple of examples. And so things that come to mind for me today are neoliberalism, Brexit, various other things. So what things are on people's mind? What things are under threat in the world we live in? What things need to be preserved? What things are worth fighting for? How is anti-Welsh? Again, I say anti-Welsh, but what I mean is sort of like, attitudes towards the Welsh language. How is it adapted to the 21st century from the Victorian, from the Romantic, from the, early modern period? We're not worried about the language of the exchequer anymore. What is it a threat to? Where does it fit in neoliberalism and Brexit? What has changed? ... So here's just some headlines. Let it go. The Welsh language should be consigned to history. Beth Eor, you can read that. The point. What is the point? So, simply, in the 21st century, what do we need it for? Why are we devoting resources to this? It's an historical language, and you see that they said that in the 19th century too, and the 18th century for that matter, and the 17th, 16th. It's always somehow been this historical language. Language expert left speechless after Sky News suggests Welsh is pointless. So that's sort of, you don't hear people using the word pointless in the Victorian era, right? They said other things. And so now the word pointless carries different weight. The 15-year-old presenter, you all probably know of some of these things, of The Weakest Link, renowned for her abrupt manner towards contestants, told Room 101's host that the roots of their problem lie way back in her Liverpool childhood. I didn't know what happens in Wales on a Tuesday, but they all used to come to Liverpool and speak Welsh. It was a conspiracy, clearly. It's quite confusing for a young child to wake up every Tuesday and find nobody speaks the same language as you. I've just grown to dislike them more and more for that reason. The BBC Newsnight guest claims £150 million of taxpayers' money is wasted on the Welsh language. So in an era of scarcity, in an era where, money is hard to come by, this is heavy language. Look, that's a big number wasted on the Welsh language. Why? The Welsh government is wasting that much of taxpayer money that could be spent on the NHS, right? So, like, again, what are the 21st century forms of whatever the attitudes are? We weren't worried about the NHS 200 years ago. Today, why are we putting money into this? Brexit could devastate Celtic languages. The children's magazine criticized after calling Welsh a waste of money. Again, we heard a little bit of that before talking about the Eisteddfod, but a little bit different now. Again, in a period where unemployment is rising, and the quality of life is dipping, longevity is decreasing, life expectancy. How could you spend money on a language, right? So we can see what form this is taking. Welsh language at risk if Britain leaves the European Union. The language groups have signed a letter warning of the consequences of Brexit for minority languages. And again, notice that this isn't, with the exception of the Weakest Link person, maybe, like, by and large, these aren't anti-Welsh as such. It's more that they're pro something else, for instance, like, if we didn't need to, spend all this money on Welsh, it wouldn't be seen as a threat to something that affects me, right? So again, it's more complicated than just being anti or pro. It's not easy to reconcile always, right? So what has changed and what has stayed the same? So A.N. Wilson, writing in 1993, wrote in 1993, allegedly, that the Welsh have never made any significant contribution to any branch of knowledge, culture, or entertainment. They have no architecture, no gastronomic tradition, no literature worthy of the name. And now you know these are strong claims, but now, from reading the Blue Books, you know just how unoriginal they are, right? You know, doesn't A.N. Wilson, he must know that people were saying the same thing 250 years ago. More than that, 270. And so, what has stayed the same? And what has changed? And what do we do with that? Well, how does knowing some of the history influence and affect how we understand today? And what do we do with the knowledge that we have? And so that's where I will leave you. I don't have the answers to these things. I hope that sort of looking again a little bit at the lineage of some of these attitudes sort of gives you a more comprehensive grasp or sort of radius of understanding of them, especially in a 21st century context, gives you more to think about, gives you more to say when confronted with these things in person. What would you say to Mr. A.N. Wilson, for instance, who's saying these things and pretending that he came up with them? Doesn't he know that these same cruel attitudes have been around for a long time? And if we are to, for instance, defend the Welsh language, answer some of these allegations, how do we do it in a 21st century context? And with that, thank you. And I hope that you have enjoyed this talk and your program. Please be in touch with any questions or any thoughts, or if you want to talk about the Welsh language. Good luck with everything, and I'll see you around. Hwyl, diolch.